Today is Mexico's Independence Day, and I'll admit, since moving here, I've never leaned into the festivities the way I have this year. Maybe it's because the differences between the country I'm living in and the one I came from are becoming more stark. Then, too, perhaps it's because last night, Claudia Sheinbaum, Mexico's first woman president, stepped onto the balcony of the National Palace to deliver her first Grito de Dolores, the midnight ritual that begins the independence-related festivities. The Grito reaches back to 1810, when Father Miguel Hidalgo rang the church bell in the town of Dolores and called his people to rise up against Spanish rule. Every year since, Mexico remembers that cry, the bell, the names of its heroes shouted into the night, the crowd answering back with a thunderous Viva! Fireworks splitting the sky, church bells tolling, and finally the national anthem drawing everyone's voices together. But this year was different. Scheinbaum used this moment to include not only the familiar names of male independence leaders, but also the anonymous heroines whose sacrifices have gone long unacknowledged. That matters because independence rituals are about collective memory, and I believe what's remembered shapes what a nation believes about itself. For generations, Mexico has been slow to honor the women who fought, strategized, and kept the rebellion alive. Last night, their names, even in their anonymity, were finally included in the Grito. I've said this many times, and it's a hill I'll continue to live on. Mexico's northern neighbor has a lot to learn from it. After the Grito always comes the anthem. I still don't know the words, though my landlord insists I should learn it. She's been teasing me about my Spanish for years now, saying that if I want to become a Mexican citizen, I'll need to be able to sing the national anthem by heart. She would know. She came here from Venezuela and became a citizen herself just 2 years ago. For her, the anthem was part of the process. For me, I'm not sure if that's entirely true, but either way, it's something I do want to learn one day. Maybe now is as good a time as any. In the Grito de Dolores, I hear my own battle cry. But mine didn't come with the rocket's red glare or bombs bursting in the air. My grito was a silent rebellion. I left my homeland. It was a strategy that for many seemed nonsensical, heretical even. But staying had started to feel like a kind of violence I was inflicting on myself, like refusing to read the writing on the wall. Everywhere I turned, racism and anti-blackness undergirded everything. They showed up in institutions, in everyday exchanges, in the so-called opportunities that were supposed to be stepping stones. It got to the point where even the ordinary felt weaponized. The air I breathed, the cost of food, the policies that determined who makes it home and who doesn't. I knew I had to get out and land in a place where my skin color didn't make me a walking death sentence. In the midst of my weariness, Toni Morrison's words came alive for me. She says, the function, the very serious function of racism is distraction. It keeps you from doing your work. It keeps you explaining over and over again your reason for being. Somebody says you have no language, and you spend 20 years proving that you do. Somebody says your head isn't shaped properly, so you have scientists working on the fact that it is. Somebody says you have no art, and you dredge that up. Somebody says you have no kingdoms, so you dredge that up. None of this is necessary. There will always be one more thing. I had reached the point where I could finally see it, even if only faintly, that none of it was necessary for me anymore. None of the proving, the performing, or the contorting. I could imagine my freedom beyond America's shores. I could see, just in the distance, how unnecessary it was to remain in a country that insisted on finding new ways to undermine my existence. So I stopped waiting for things to change, and instead, I changed my circumstances. I left. I booked the one-way ticket. That was my rebellion. That was my grito. And once I was here in Mexico, the pull to stay started to feel strangely ancestral. When I traced the origins of my lineages years ago, nothing indicated that Mexico was in my family tree. My roots are in Guinea-Bissau and Gabon, 2 countries on the coast of West Africa. So at first, I told myself it was just timing. Mexico's borders were open when so many others were closed during the pandemic. But after about 6 months of living here, that explanation stopped making sense. Something in my spirit knew my landing here wasn't a coincidence, and I can assure you it wasn't about chasing digital nomad dreams either. The confirmation came as I met more Black Americans who had found their way here too. We were responding to a call that reached deeper, one that felt like providence. It's a big reason why I started Black Expat Stories, to document this movement in real time, to gather the testimonials of people who, like me, decided that staying in the U.S. was no longer tenable and dared to embrace a better quality of life elsewhere. But when I began writing The Exodus is when I discovered where that ancestral tug might have come from. I learned that Mexico has always been part of our liberation story. U.S. history books like to stop the Underground Railroad at the Canadian border, but if you trace the routes further, you find paths running south, across the Rio Grande and onto Mexican soil. Under Spanish rule, Mexico was part of the transatlantic slave trade, but independence shifted the ground. Leaders like Miguel Hidalgo and Jose Maria Morelos, the latter of African descent, tied freedom for the enslaved to freedom for the nation. Vicente Guerrero, Mexico's second president, also had African ancestry, and in 1829, from that position of power, he issued the decree that abolished slavery in Mexico altogether, less than a decade after breaking from Spain, and more than 3 decades before the U.S. would do the same. Black people were present in that struggle from the beginning, as soldiers, generals, farmers, and fugitives who crossed into Mexico and joined the fight against Spain. Some of the same people who fled Texas and Louisiana ended up fighting for Mexico's independence. Liberation here was not handed down from on high. It was carved out by people in motion, people who risked everything to reclaim and protect their inherent freedom. For years, Mexico resisted the United States' demand to return the people who had escaped across the border, and to no avail. This country stood on business. In fact, it can be argued that Mexico's refusal is one of the reasons slavery didn't expand further west to what is now known as California. And when I hold that history in mind, something else becomes clear. Why the Mexico I read in American history books and the Mexico I saw in U.S. mainstream media always looked a certain way. Poor, corrupt, dangerous, and backwards. Living here forced me to question all of that and to interrogate how much of what I've been taught was propaganda designed to keep me looking down on this place. As an immigrant, I've had to rely less on the stories I inherited and more on the reality I live, because as it turns out, the girls up north are still big mad that Mexico stood its ground when it came to slavery, and they've never let it go. That's another reason why I'm so intent on writing this book. People need to know these things, especially Black people, so they can stop asking me if I'm safe here, so they can stop clutching their pearls when I tell them I live in Mexico, so they can stop making the cartel their first question as if violence is Mexico's only story. Because anybody looking at the United States right now has every right to ask, "Ho, is you cool?" For me, those distortions about Mexico often bring what Malcolm X once said to mind. If you're not careful, the newspapers will have you hating the people who are oppressed and loving the people who are doing the oppressing. Unfortunately, the mainstream story of this country has been flattened into caricature, and I refuse to let that stand uncontested. But let's be clear, I'm not here to romanticize Mexico either. It has its many challenges, like any place in the world does, and unlike other places in ways that are uniquely its own. But what I can say without hesitation is that in the 4 years I've lived here, it has been a better place for me, a better place than the one I left. And for that, I'm grateful. I also understand that's not a neutral statement. It's privileged. I am American. That alone affords me the kind of mobility and access that isn't extended to all of the local people or the immigrants from the global South trying to cross into the United States. Being Black complicates that privilege back home, but here it bends in my favor, giving me a quality of life that sometimes makes me wince when I remember what's denied to others. Especially when I think about how the U.S. treats the very people who look like my landlord, my neighbors, and my friends by racially profiling them for their appearance or languages spoken, yanking them off the streets, caging them at the border, vilifying them in the press, and breaking up their families. It's despicable. So much of my journey has been about expanding my scope of understanding and about learning to hold gratitude for what this move has given me, while also witnessing the struggles of the people around me. Mexico is still fighting its own battles, and yet, even in the fight, there has been progress. In just 6 years, 13.4 million people have been lifted out of poverty, for example. And under Claudia Sheinbaum's leadership, there have been efforts to push that progress further with programs like El Pensión para el Bienestar, which now provides financial support to women between 60 and 64, with priority given to Indigenous and Afro-Mexican women. These aren't silver bullets, but they're tangible attempts to widen the floor of who gets to live with dignity while chipping away at deeply entrenched inequities in a country that has been long defined as macho. And still, the critiques matter. Organizers caution that gestures aren't enough, that symbolism can mask the depth of structural inequalities that women, Indigenous peoples, and Afro-Mexicans continue to face here. They're not wrong. Independence is unfinished business. But this is the paradox I live inside, finding my own liberation in a country that is still working out its own. Here, it seems like the struggle is toward repair. There, in the U.S., the drift is toward collapse under white Christian nationalism and authoritarianism. If Mexico is attempting to address what has been neglected and broken, things like women's rights, poverty, and social protections, then the Trump administration has been busy doing the opposite, gutting rights, scapegoating the vulnerable, and dragging the U.S. closer to the Gilead that Margaret Atwood warns us about in The Handmaid's Tale. If I'm being honest, I'll share that I trust the direction Mexico is moving in more than the path the U.S. has chosen, and that's why I've stayed here for so long. I didn't know when I first arrived that Mexico would elect its first woman president, but it feels good to live in a country attempting to right its historical wrongs instead of denying they ever happened. And as I watched La Presidenta ring the bell and lead the grito, I couldn't help but wonder how different things might have been in the U.S. if not for the virulent anti-blackness that keeps us suspended in subjugation. You can't make me believe white supremacy isn't some kind of mental illness. There's nothing inherently supreme about whiteness, and yet it has been the world's deadliest delusion of grandeur. Sometimes I catch myself imagining another timeline, one where Kamala won and the descent into fascism didn't hit with such force. In that world, my friends and loved ones back home would have had more time to brace for the empire's collapse, more time to prepare, to breathe, to decide how they wanted to live on the other side of it. I've never believed her victory would have delivered a utopia, but it might have slowed the free fall and maybe bought us a measure of time, because the collapse is coming. Of that, I have no doubt. What unsettles me most is the speed, the sense that chaos has already become permanently entrenched. I can't lie. Watching this unraveling from a neighboring country has only solidified my gratitude for where I've landed. If the U.S. feels like it's in free fall, Mexico has served as the ground beneath my feet. It's not a flawless place by a long shot, but it's been steady enough for me to rebuild my life. As I celebrate another Independence Day here in Mexico, I finally understand what it means to be free indeed. I also feel something I never quite felt back in the States, like I have a fighting chance, a chance to live out the dreams my ancestors never could, and the new ones that have been finally freed from white supremacist delusions. So while this place may not always be my base, it will always hold a special place in my heart for catching me when I dare to leap into the unknown, and for being a refuge as I continue to walk freedom's path. God bless this country, its land, and its people, all of which have in time become mine too. Viva Mexico. America's next great migration is underway, and this time it's gone global. Black Expat Stories is here to capture it. We're documenting the pioneers of the Blaxit movement through intimate conversations that go well beyond the highlight reel. Because these aren't just interviews, they're testimonies. Testimonies of courage, of healing, and of how we made it over. Every story becomes part of our living cultural archive, so that future generations won't have to guess how we felt or why we left. They'll hear it straight from us. We've built a global community rooted in solidarity, truth-telling, and mutual care. And we're just getting started. So, if this work has moved you, if it sparked something in you, affirmed your path, or expanded your sense of what's possible, I invite you to support the show today. Visit blackexpatstories.com/support. Your contributions help us capture more on-location stories, elevate our production, and lay the foundation for a future docuseries on the Blaxit movement. That's blackexpatstories.com/support, because this isn't just a moment, it's a movement. And with your help, we'll make sure the revolution is televised so these stories echo far beyond our time.